A single grocery bag saved a man's life, and Anna never even saw it coming. It started as a small gesture. Every week, she left a bag of groceries at Mr. Thompson's doorstep. She never spoke to him, never saw him bring them in. But something told her to keep doing it. Then one morning, everything changed. A small white envelope peeked out from under her doormat. Frowning, she picked it up. Her fingers trembled slightly as she peeled it open. Inside, in shaky handwriting, were just a few words. "Thank you. You don't know how much this means." A quiet warmth spread through her chest. He had noticed. He had accepted the help. And somehow, those few words made it feel important. The following week, she did it again. Another bag, another quiet delivery. And the next morning, another note. "The apples reminded me of my late wife's pies. She made the best in town." The week after that, another message. "I haven't had homemade bread in years. It brought back memories of my mother's kitchen." Each note revealed something deeper. Mr. Thompson wasn't just an old man living alone. He had a past, a life filled with love and memories that still lingered in the empty spaces of his home. But one thing stood out. He never asked for anything. His notes were always about gratitude, never requests. As if he didn't want to be a burden. And maybe that's what made Anna continue. Week after week, their quiet exchange continued. She left groceries, he left notes, until one morning, something changed. Anna stepped onto her porch and froze. No envelope, no note. At first, she brushed it off. Maybe he had forgotten, maybe he ran out of paper. But as the hours passed and the silence stretched, a cold feeling crept into her chest. Something wasn't right. And deep down, she knew. This wasn't just a missed note. Something was wrong, and she was about to find out what. Anna's pulse quickened as she stepped off her porch. The air felt heavier, the quietness of the neighborhood unsettling in a way she couldn't explain. She walked toward Mr. Thompson's house, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement. His curtains were drawn. The porch light was still off, the mailbox untouched. A creeping unease tightened in her chest. She knocked, lightly at first, then harder. "Mr. Thompson?" Her voice wavered. "It's Anna." Silence. She swallowed, glancing down. That's when she noticed it. A newspaper, yellowed and slightly damp, still lying on the front step. A chill ran down her spine. It had rained 2 days ago. Her heart pounded as she turned, searching for someone, anyone, who might know something. That's when she saw her neighbor, Mrs. Carter, standing outside her house a few doors down, watering her plants. Anna rushed over, her words spilling out before she could stop them. "Mrs. Carter, have you seen Mr. Thompson?" The older woman looked up, frowning. "Not for days." "Why?" Anna pointed toward his house, her stomach twisting. "He's not answering. His paper is still there. I have a bad feeling." Mrs. Carter's expression darkened. She set down her watering can, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's not like him." Anna's breath came faster. "I think we need to check on him." Mrs. Carter hesitated, then nodded. "Come on." Together, they hurried back to the front door. Anna knocked again, harder this time. "Mr. Thompson, it's Anna and Mrs. Carter. Can you hear us?" Nothing. Mrs. Carter inhaled sharply. Her fingers hovered over the doorknob. Then, click, the door creaked open. A stale, heavy air drifted out. The inside of the house was eerily quiet. Anna exchanged a look with Mrs. Carter. Neither of them spoke, but they both knew something was very, very wrong. Anna's mind raced. Mr. Thompson was breathing, but barely. His skin felt clammy, his face sunken and pale. "Mr. Thompson, can you hear me?" Her voice was urgent, but gentle. A faint, almost inaudible sound escaped his lips, but his eyes remained closed. Mrs. Carter fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed. "Yes, we need an ambulance. Elderly man, unresponsive but breathing. 314 Oakwood Drive. Please hurry." Anna's throat tightened as she looked around the dimly lit room. An empty water glass sat on the nightstand. A plate of untouched food sat nearby, dried and forgotten. How long had he been like this? Her gaze landed on a small, tattered notebook resting beside the plate. The cover was old, its edges frayed. A pen lay on top of it, as if it had been set down mid-thought. She hesitated, then picked it up. The most recent page was scrawled in shaky, uneven handwriting. "Didn't want to bother anyone, but I think this might be it." Anna's chest tightened. The weight of those words pressed down on her. He had known. He had been suffering in silence, alone, believing no one would notice. But she had noticed. Her hands gripped his frail fingers. "Hold on, Mr. Thompson," she whispered. "Help is coming." The distant wail of sirens cut through the silence. Mrs. Carter exhaled sharply. "They're almost here." Anna nodded, but her thoughts were racing. This was more than just a medical emergency. This was a man who had nearly slipped away, unseen, unheard. And she wasn't going to let that happen. Anna's breath hitched as she stepped inside, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. The air was thick with dust and something else, something unsettling. The living room was undisturbed. A worn armchair sat near the fireplace, a folded blanket draped over its back. A pair of reading glasses rested on the coffee table, next to an open book, its pages yellowed with time. But then, her eyes landed on the grocery bag. The same one she had left a week ago, untouched. A sharp knot formed in her stomach. Mrs. Carter moved beside her, her voice barely above a whisper. "Anna, this isn't good." Anna swallowed hard. Her legs felt stiff as she took a step forward, scanning the quiet house. The silence pressed against her ears, loud in its emptiness. Then, a sound, faint, a whisper, a groan. Anna froze. She turned toward the hallway, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Mrs. Carter nodded, her face pale. It came from the back. Without thinking, Anna moved. Past the quiet kitchen, past the framed photographs lining the hall, frozen moments of a life that now felt distant. Then she saw it. The bedroom door, slightly open. Her fingers trembled as she reached out and pushed it wider. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight. Her eyes adjusted slowly, scanning the bed, the nightstand. And then, Mr. Thompson, motionless beneath thin, wrinkled sheets. Anna's breath caught in her throat. For a split second, everything stopped. Then suddenly she was at his side. "Mr. Thompson?" No response, no stir. Mrs. Carter let out a sharp gasp. "Oh, dear God!" Anna's hands shook as she reached for his wrist, pressing her fingers to his cold, fragile skin. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then a pulse, weak, unsteady. But there. Anna let out a shuddering breath. He's alive. But barely. And something was very, very wrong. The front door burst open, and heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. Paramedics rushed in, their voices sharp and focused. Anna and Mrs. Carter stepped back as the team worked quickly, checking vitals, securing an oxygen mask over Mr. Thompson's face, lifting his frail body with practiced care. One paramedic glanced at Anna. "He's severely dehydrated, blood pressure's dangerously low, but he's still with us." Anna's chest tightened. Relief. Guilt. 1,000 emotions tangled inside her. She looked down at the notebook still clutched in her hands. The final unfinished line stared back at her. "I think this might be it." Her throat burned. Mr. Thompson had believed he was alone, that no one would come, that no one cared. But he was wrong. As they wheeled him toward the ambulance, Anna followed, gripping the notebook tighter. This wasn't just about groceries anymore. She wasn't going to let him slip away. Not now. Not ever.